Hi, everyone.
Hey, everyone.
I'm Lekha Shupek. I'm the North Carolina State Director for All on the Line.
And I'm Bri. I'm the digital organizer with All on the Line.
And we're coming to you today because you probably knew there was a redistricting trial this week, but you probably did not watch, at least 24 hours worth of testimony, more than that?
Yeah.
32 hours? I don't know.
Yeah. Lekha watched it so you don't have to.
Yeah, pretty much.
So now we're going to talk about it. We're going to go over what happened. I'm going to ask Lekha all the burning questions about to kind of recap for folks who maybe didn't watch every second.
Yeah.
But we'll unpack some of what we heard and what's happening now. So we'll get started.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Thanks for watching all of that and live tweeting it.
I mean, I have to say, I got a lot of people who were like, "Oh, thanks so much for covering this," and I was like, I wouldn't be doing anything else with my time.
It's
true. This is what I would be doing in my free time, probably, because
you're
I'm
that
kind of
nerd.
person. So
it's just lucky that you're getting paid, and someone's even sending you pie.
I know.
For your service.
Some of our dear friends at Carolina Forward said they were going to send us some pie. It was so nice.
Yeah.
We'll update you about the pie. We'll take a picture with the pie.
Yeah. Okay, so why don't we start with just, can you give a little overview, what's the context for this trial? Who are the plaintiffs? Who are the defendants? And who's hearing this case?
Okay, so this is a case over the enacted redistricting maps, and the redistricting maps that were drawn at the end of last year. So that's state legislative maps and congressional maps. And the plaintiffs are suing over those maps because they believe that they are extreme partisan gerrymanders in such a way that is unconstitutional under our state constitution. And so there are actually a number of plaintiffs. So there are the Harper plaintiffs. So if you're familiar, in 2019, we also had a partisan redistricting case. And Harper et al. Were the plaintiffs in that case. And they are also, that same plaintiff group is suing in this case. And then also there is the North Carolina League of Conservation Voters is another plaintiff, and some of their members are also plaintiffs that are suing. And then Common Cause North Carolina, another organization, is suing, I think probably along with some other plaintiffs on their side as well. So it's three different kind of groups of plaintiffs, but they all have slightly different claims about the maps, but very similar. These maps are an extreme partisan gerrymander in such a way that it contradicts our state constitution.
And the Harper plaintiffs are just regular people who live in the impacted districts.
Yeah, so each of these plaintiff groups has some, as far as I know, some individual plaintiffs who are just ordinary people who are affected by these districts personally. And then some of the other plaintiffs groups are organizations.
Yeah, great. And what did you already talk about? What court is this case being heard
Yeah,
in?
So this is being heard in Superior Court, and it's actually a special 3-judge panel, Superior Court 3-judge panel. So in North Carolina, we basically have a system by which any kind of redistricting case has to be heard by a specially appointed 3-judge Superior Court panel. So they're the Chief Justice of the North Carolina State Supreme Court, which right now is Paul Newby, appoints 3 Superior Court judges to hear any kinds of redistricting cases that come up.
So they'll hear if there are future cases, the same group of judges would hear those cases.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's some turnover.
Right.
I'm not sure at what interval these kind of courts get reappointed, but probably anything that happens this year.
Great. And so you touched on this a little bit, but what is being litigated here? What are the plaintiffs? What is their challenge to these maps?
Yeah. So the main claim is that these maps are extreme partisan gerrymanders, and that the way that they are extreme partisan gerrymanders is against our state constitution. So our state constitution, there are 3 provisions that the plaintiffs are relying on. So they're relying on our free elections clause. So in the North Carolina state constitution, it says all elections shall be free. And the plaintiffs are saying that means that, elections should be free and fair. Partisan gerrymandering undermines that. They are also using the freedom of speech and freedom of association clauses in our state constitution. So the way these districts are drawn, prevents people from sort of freely expressing themselves politically, from associating with others freely politically. And then also the Equal Protection Clause of our state constitution. So basically, these districts, by being partisan gerrymanders, are preventing people or are treating people differently on the basis of their voting habits, their political associations, political identification.
And that's the same or similar argument to a previous case.
Yeah, so the Common Cause versus Lewis case, that's that 2019 case that caused our, the redrawing of the districts. The districts that we used in 2020 were based on the districts that were redrawn because of that case, or they were the districts that were redrawn because of that case. And that was the same argument that the Harper plaintiffs were, that the Common Cause versus Lewis plaintiffs were making in that case. There was also Harper was the congressional maps case, so but very similar basis.
Okay, so we heard the trial opened with the plaintiffs laying out their case first, mm-hmm. and the first few witnesses were expert witnesses. We heard a lot of math. We heard from a lot of very smart people. What were those witnesses called to address, and what did they talk about?
Yeah, so those witnesses were, the first few witnesses we heard from were all expert witnesses. So these are people who, by and large, were mathematicians. Some political scientists, mostly mathematicians, though, who sort of are known, at least on the plaintiff side, in their field for doing this sort of complex mathematical analysis that identifies partisan gerrymandering, identifies extreme partisan gerrymandering. And I can talk about
those. So why don't we talk about, we heard several different kinds of analysis. Can we walk through what were the different kinds of analysis that we heard, maybe some examples?
Yeah, so I'll talk about each kind and then I'll show you an example. So one kind of analysis that was done was called Ensemble Analysis, and that was done by experts. There's Dr. Joey Chen and Dr. Mattingly from Duke did do this kind of ensemble analysis. And so what that is that basically you create an algorithm and you give the algorithm rules. So our, let's say, legislature set up redistricting criteria. Those are the rules by which they were going to draw the maps that said, these maps, the districts have to have equal population within these bounds. They have to be contiguous. They should be relatively compact. They should respect precincts and municipalities and not split them too much. And so you kind of put all of those rules into an algorithm, and then the algorithm generates a bunch of maps based on those rules. And so the idea is that by putting all of these sort of nonpartisan rules in, so things like compactness and contiguity and not splitting municipalities are considered nonpartisan, right? They are neutral. And so by having an algorithm create sort of randomly a bunch of maps under these nonpartisan criteria, you can compare them to the enacted maps and see whether or not the enacted maps are sort of within the range of what you would expect for maps being drawn on a nonpartisan basis. And
so just so I'm really clear, so they took the same criteria that the legislators said they were using, and they built a unique algorithm to spit out maps based on that criteria, so we could compare what we got from the enacted maps and what a computer generated map would look like.
Yeah, and I'll show you an example of sort of what this ends up looking like. So this is from Mattingly's simulated maps. I think he simulated about 1,000 maps. And so what you see here, like those purple kind of ridges, those are his simulated maps. So, you make a bunch of simulated maps, and then what he's doing, each one of these lines represents a different election. So he basically uses statewide elections. So you can see there's like AG 16, so that's Attorney General's 2016 election. Or at the bottom, there's like LG 16, that's the Lieutenant Governor in 2016 election. So what he's doing is that he's using those election data and sort of projecting them onto his simulated maps and showing us the range of outcomes. So those sort of different purple levels, those are the sort of the distribution of how all of his maps respond. And then if you can see, I don't know if you can see the color that well, but there are those little circles on the left of each of those purple hills. And that's where the enacted map is. That's the enacted map's result. And so what you can see that he's showing is that in pretty much every single one of these elections, that little yellow circle is falling far to the left, which means far fewer Democrats would be elected under those same election results than in his distribution of sort of nonpartisan maps. And so that's what he is showing. That's how he shows that the map is a partisan outlier, is that the enacted maps are always, under all of these different elections, always electing way fewer Democrats than any of these nonpartisan maps that, you would expect to represent the range of possibility for a map that was, drawn under sort of nonpartisan criteria. Does that make sense?
He's basically saying that the maps that were drawn by the legislature are statistical outliers.
Yes.
For how many Democrats can get elected under them.
Yeah, basically he's saying that they are producing results that are on the edge or, in a lot of cases, far outside, far lower number of Democrats than you would expect from a nonpartisan map.
Okay. So that's the ensemble analysis.
And so the next analysis is what's called Markov chain Monte Carlo, which is this
very fun name.
Yeah, really fun name. Sounds super complicated. I actually found this trial helpful because I have had a very hard time understanding how this works, but I think that Dr. Wesley Pegden was the one who did this kind of analysis for the plaintiffs. And he actually explained it really, really well. And so what his analysis does is a little bit similar to Ensemble, but what he's doing is he starts from the enacted map. So he uses the enacted map as his basis, and then he has an algorithm that makes tiny random changes to the map. And so he makes tiny random changes to the map and thereby generates trillions of maps. He's working with huge numbers of maps. And so what he's measuring is how optimized the map is for partisan advantage. So basically, if you take the enacted map and you make a tiny change, does that make the map more or less effective for Republicans? And basically what he found was that in pretty much every case, any change that you make makes the map less effective for Republicans. And that's not something that you would see. If you just generated a map that was on neutral criteria, that just, was, or even if you generated a map that was partisan but not extremely partisan, every random change wouldn't always make it less effective. It would make it more effective sometimes, less effective sometimes. But the fact that every map is making it less effective, that's sort of what the point that he's making.
They maximize
so
how partisan the maps are, according to this analysis.
Yeah, so this is one of his charts, which is just amazing to me if you look at it. So he's looking at the percentage of comparison maps that are less partisan than the enacted plan. So he's running all these maps, these trillions and trillions of maps, and out of trillions and trillions of maps, all the time he's getting every single other of the trillions of maps is 99.9999 or 99999 or 9999999 are less partisan than the enacted maps.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it's the figures are crazy.
It's actually kind of mind-blowing.
Yeah, out of trillions of maps, and he kind of actually does a second level of analysis where, first he kind of starts with just running these iterations off of the enacted maps. And then he kind of created a second level of data that's any possible map. So he basically generates any map you could possibly draw under the criteria that were chosen by the legislature, and he still gets that the enacted maps are, more optimized for partisan advantage than 99.99.
Any map that you could draw.
Yeah, basically.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then we had an overlay analysis.
Yeah, so that was Dr. Moon Dushin, who's also really well known in the field for her work on gerrymandering issues. She's from Tufts University.
I saw people on Twitter were very excited to see
her.
her.
She's kind of like a celebrity, I guess, in a lot of ways in that field. She seems super cool.
Yeah, super cool.
And so what she did was something that was actually much simpler. She basically said, I knew that a lot of people were going to be doing ensemble analysis and all the other kinds of analysis. So what she did was she basically just took there, was the enacted maps. And then the North Carolina League of Conservation Voters had someone draw what they felt were sort of like fair maps. And so she just compared the enacted maps to the maps drawn by League of Conservation Voters across a bunch of election results. And she's calling this an overlay analysis, where she overlays...
She's comparing the two.
Yeah, she overlays the results of different elections on these maps and just sees what the outcome is. And so that's a bit simpler, but to show you what that looks like, she made this chart. And so in this chart, on the bottom is sort of the percentage of Democratic votes going from like 42% to 58%. That's how many votes Democrats are getting in statewide election.
In a given election.
In a given statewide election. She's using other elections to kind of model this. And she's looking at what results each of the maps get. And so those red dots are the enacted maps, and the green dots are the League of Conservation Voter maps.
So it looks like what's happening here is when the Democratic share of the vote goes up under the enacted maps, it doesn't change the number of Democrats who are elected. Yeah,
so these sort of horizontal, these diagonal lines are sort of different ways you could expect the map to be responding, but you can see sort of that yellow dot there, the dot that's highlighted in yellow, that's the way that the enacted congressional map is responding. If Democrats get 52% of the vote, which is quite high, right? Mm-hmm. We have a very even state. They're still only getting 4 seats. So the y-axis?
The y-axis, yeah.
Sorry, math has been really
Math is hard.
Yeah. But anyway, the y-axis shows you how many Democratic seats the congressional maps are going to produce. And so you can see that even when your Democrats are getting 52% of the vote in a particular election, they still are only getting 4 seats. And that's really strange. Whereas when they're getting more like 7 or 8 seats in the...
So the green dots are the
League of Conservation Voters maps, which is sort of like what they're saying is a fair map.
And what you would expect is that the more votes that the one side gets, the more seats they would get. And that's sort of that's what happens with the green maps.
Yeah, exactly.
And not with the
and something that's really interesting that she said is that she said sort of like that upper left quadrant and the lower right quadrant, she was saying like those are sort of no man's land, because whenever you're in there, it basically means that the party that's getting less votes is getting more seats. And she says that that's sort of a no-go area for fairness if you see things falling in there. And so we can see very much that the enacted maps are falling in there.
Okay, so kind of big picture, what would you, if you were going to just have a summary statement of what that analysis that we heard shows, could you sort of summarize that?
Yeah, basically you have these experts in their field, very well recognized experts, published a ton, or just sort of universally recognized in academia as being the go-to people for these kinds of topics, are saying that under all of these different ways of measuring, that these maps are extreme partisan gerrymanders that you just could not get unless you were trying to create an extreme partisan gerrymander. It just couldn't happen by accident, couldn't be the result of just sort of the natural political geography of North Carolina. So I think one argument you hear a lot, and one argument the defense made is, well, these enacted maps, these results are just because Democrats all live crowded together and Republicans are more spread out. But because of the way this analysis are done, that's already built in, right? They're already using North Carolina maps. They're using the same rules that the legislature gave itself to draw maps. And so that should already be built in. So if you're still seeing that those maps are much more extreme than, say, the simulated maps or the Markov chain generated maps, then you're getting a result that's more extreme than anything that's predicted by just the geography.
And we even heard, I can't remember which one, but one of the witnesses even said, like, their analysis indicates intent, that there was clearly had to have been intent to make these maps as partisan as they were.
Yeah, I believe that may have been pegged in, but basically that they're saying that, like, there's no other way you could get this map other than going in to create a partisan gerrymander. So, if you were going in and you were just trying to protect BTDs, you were just trying to protect municipalities.
Just follow the criteria.
Yeah, any other reason that you would go in and draw maps could not generate a map that was this finely tuned for partisan advantage.
Okay, so what was the defense response to this? That seems pretty, pretty impactful.
Yeah.
Have all these different experts testifying.
Yeah.
So what was the defense response?
So as far as expert testimony, they really only had one expert that you could say did something comparable. And that was Dr. Barber. He is a political science professor from BYU, and he did his own ensemble analysis. So something that came out in cross-examination, Dr. Barber has never published, he's never done an ensemble analysis that's been peer-reviewed and published. It's just not have been part of his academic work. He doesn't have a history of it. And while all of the plaintiffs experts, are people who have published extensively and also are building their own algorithms, he used an open source algorithm that someone else had made to do his ensemble analysis. So that was one thing. And then basically, he was really heavily criticized by a lot of the plaintiffs' experts for the way that he did that. And I'll show you sort of what he was doing that they were criticizing. So I think that this was out of his expert report. Basically, what he was doing is he was only looking grouping by grouping. So first of all, let's just say, there was no expert evidence offered by the defendants about the congressional maps at all. They just did not address them. So they only looked at the state legislative maps. And
but the plaintiffs all their expert witnesses looked at all three maps. Or
I think so. I'm not sure if that's true, but the plaintiffs definitely had experts that addressed all three of the maps. Somewhere in there they were covered. And so he was just looking at state legislative maps. And what he was doing is for each county grouping, so North Carolina, we have this weird county groupings thing where like the districts are drawn within these county groupings that are also determined by a particular formula, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, that would take a whole other...
We have other videos on that.
Yeah, we do. And so what he was doing was he would generate 50,000 maps for each county grouping with this open source algorithm that he was using, that he had put in the criteria into. But what he would do that he was being criticized by the plaintiffs for was that he would then knock out a bunch of those maps. So this is an example, Brunswick, New Hanover is a county grouping, so that's where Wilmington is. So he'd generate 50,000 maps using the criteria that the legislature used, programming in the same way. Then he would take out any maps that didn't have the exact same metrics as the enacted map. So let's say the enacted map, let's say that one of the generated maps was 0.1% less compact than the enacted map. So like very, very, very little less compact than the enacted map. It's out. Anything that is 0.00001% less compact than the enacted map is probably also out. Anything that does not meet that same standard.
Even though in the criteria, the defendants very explicitly said they weren't going to rank which criteria was more important.
Yeah, during the process, they didn't rank the criteria at all. They didn't say which were more important. And in fact,
he threw out any map that was any amount less good on any criteria.
Yeah, exactly. And I think something that we know is that compactness, I think, in the past people used to really emphasize that because we used to have these gerrymander maps that were very kind of visually ugly. Mm-hmm. But I think that something that experts have kind of realized over the past few years is you can have maps that look pretty, that are compact. Compactness tends to look nice.
It's one important thing to look at.
But it doesn't necessarily mean that the people in that map are being better represented.
Just compactness of it in and of itself doesn't make
so he was really setting a standard. Anything that was less compact or had more kind of county traversals, which is just like the number of times that a county is split up. He discarded all of those. So basically what that means is that he started with 50,000 maps, but then he ends up only keeping 500-ish of those maps. So you can see here, starts with 50,000, and after he knocks out maps, he gets 562 maps. And what's that? That's, let's see, 5,000 would be 10%, 500, 1% of the total maps that he generated. And so now, it sounds like, okay, well, if there are only 500 maps, you're kind of, it doesn't seem as representative of 50,000, right?
No.
You're knocking out a bunch of stuff on a sort of, and you're getting a lot less to compare it to.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of the plaintiffs said, by doing this, you are really putting a thumb on the scales of the results. You're really skewing the results. You shouldn't be having to do this kind of filtering afterwards. Whatever comes out of the algorithm should be well enough programmed that whatever you're getting out of it is good.
And the expert witnesses all, or at least some of them, said that.
There were several of the expert witnesses that wrote formal rebuttal reports to Barber's report because they had so many problems with it. And so just to show what the kind of results that he was getting, this is what, after this is not the same kind of grouping that he was talking about in that previous slide, but he was doing similar things in all of them. And basically you get these really, this doesn't look anything like the other charts that we see, but he's knocked out a ton of results, and basically the red line, which is on that 91%, is the enacted map, and then the green dotted line is the League of Conservation Voters map. And so he's kind of looking at this and saying that the League of Conservation Voters map is actually the one that's the outlier, according to this. But he's knocked out a ton of the maps, and so we just don't know what's not in there anymore. And he's comparing them to a very small... So basically, that was the thing he was being criticized by the plaintiffs for, is that basically they felt that he was putting his thumb on the scale in such a way to make the enacted maps look better, to make them fall within this distribution.
It seems like he's doing the thing that people get criticized who don't understand, statistical analysis or this kind of work, that he was massaging the data to make it look how he wants it to
and I think even Professor Dushan said that he was basically, what he was doing was keeping only one of every 503 trillion maps that he generated. It's like an infinitesimally small amount.
Okay.
So anyway, there you go. So that's so basically Barber did this ensemble analysis. He wasn't an expert. He got criticized for this. There were also a number of other things that he got criticized for. He made some charts that I think basically Professor Mattingly was like, if a student of mine showed me this chart, I'd fail them because it's so misleading. It just, across the board, the plaintiffs' experts criticized Barber and kind of tore apart his methods.
Kind of embarrassing for him.
Yeah, I was just like, I hope he's getting paid well.
Okay, so that's the expert in terms of statistical analysis of comparing maps to algorithms. We also heard from witnesses from the plaintiffs that the plaintiffs called, who testified about sort of the historical context and the process. So let's start with the context piece. Who were some of the people we heard from that talked about that?
So one person we heard from was Chris Cooper, who is a political science professor from Western Carolina. He has been an expert witness before in these cases. And he kind of was looking at the maps from more of a political science perspective, just looking at, where he felt that it was clear that Republicans were getting an extra seat because of the way the maps were drawn and things like that. So he kind of did that, kind of analysis more from just his historical knowledge of politics in North Carolina. And then we also got Professor Lelutis, who is a history professor at UNC. And he was talking about actually the sort of history of sort of politics and race relations in North Carolina, and how this sort of redistricting process and these maps fit into a history of how Black voters in particular are targeted in North Carolina, have been targeted, for, to dilute their votes, to suppress their votes. And so what he was saying is that basically we have a history in North Carolina of implementing things that look facially neutral but are designed to target Black voters. So, you all may remember the kind of omnibus voter suppression bill that I think probably passed in 2012, something like that, that came before a federal court. And a federal court said that this was designed to target Black voters with surgical precision. So basically what happened in that bill was that the people who wrote it looked specifically, the voter ID was an element, and they looked specifically at what kinds of voter ID Black people were less likely to have. And then they chose those to be the valid forms of voter ID. And so, it's facially neutral in the sense that you have this list of IDs and it just says, oh, these are the valid IDs. But in the formation of it, they were specifically choosing IDs in a way that targeted Black voters. And so what he was saying is that the way that this map kind of dilutes the votes of Black voters fits into that tradition.
That it's a pattern in North Carolina.
Yeah, it's a pattern in North Carolina for, voter suppression measures or maps to be drawn in such a way that is facially neutral, right? They say they have other explanations for it, but in effect, it is targeting and, hurting Black voters in particular. So that was really interesting.
I thought that was a really interesting testimony.
Yeah. I think people found it really compelling.
Yeah. And then they also, there were also folks who talked about, the defendants talked during the process and in the trial about how transparent the process was. But we heard from a couple of witnesses who spoke to that, and who were some of the witnesses that who was a witness that was able to shed light on the process itself?
Yeah, so one of those witnesses was Tyler Day, who I think was a witness for the Common Cause plaintiffs, and he is someone who's sort of an organizer, an activist, and who had undergone some training on how to kind of look at redistricting, draw redistricting maps, and he was watching the process. So you all may recall that the map drawing was live streamed in the sense that there were these public terminals that legislators were drawing maps on. This is a big deal
that they made a big deal about having this very transparent process.
And so one thing that Tyler was talking about was how hard, that in practice, it wasn't so much transparency as just intentionally overwhelming, or at least overwhelming. And, he was talking about how, because of the way it was set up, it was very hard, if not impossible, to tell who was drawing the maps at any given time. The mapping terminals were open constantly. You didn't know when legislators were going to show up and draw there. There were aides who were involved who were not identified, who were helping legislators draw maps or even just drawing maps while legislators sat beside them. And just that, in practice, it was not actually that transparent because of the difficulty you had in identifying what was even going on. And I think he said there was something like, in total, there was something like 200 and something videos. Most of those videos are at least 8 hours long. No idea when someone is going to show up in those videos. A lot of them are just empty space. No way to identify who's doing what. And just the fact that it was, there was this promise of transparency, but it was fulfilled in a way that was not possible for ordinary people to really keep track of or access.
It was technically transparent, but practically very difficult to navigate and to actually see what was going on and know what was happening. Yeah.
And one thing that was impressive too is that Tyler was actually watching the map drawing process, and he talked a little bit about what he noticed too. And one thing he said was that when he looked at the ways that, say, House and Senate districts were drawn, especially in the bigger counties like Wake County and Mecklenburg County, that he saw Republican legislators basically drawing Republican favoring districts first. And creating Republican favoring districts in, say, like Wake County or Mecklenburg County, and then kind of filling in the rest of the districts. And so that was something that he noticed that, he thought was dispositive.
Mm-hmm. And also just, seeing what people were bringing in and out of the room and things like that.
Yeah, basically seeing that, people were bringing materials in and out of the room. People had their phones and were looking at their phones while they were drawing maps, or people were showing other people things on their phones while maps were being drawn. So just in general that, the promise of transparency was not being lived up to.
Right. And another witness who spoke to that was Representative Zach Hawkins.
Yeah, so Representative Hawkins was on the House Redistricting Committee, and he talked about also how transparency was sort of promised and not fulfilled. So he talked about asking Representative Hall, who was the head of that committee, to, whether or not there were going to be whether or not maps were being drawn outside of the room, whether outside material, if there was going to be any policing of outside materials being brought in. He talked about other colleagues of his proposing measures by which, because we had been given this promise by legislators that no partisan data was going to be used, no racial data was going to be used, how was that actually being implemented, and just how kind of at every turn he and his colleagues tried to add transparency, they were rebuffed, right? They were just being told, we have no interest in actually policing that. It's just the honor system.
Take our word for it.
Yeah, take our word for it. And how he felt that, that was very deceptive. And that, he felt that, this was just not real transparency, because they were just obstructive towards adding any layers to ensure that people were actually doing the right thing.
Right, and he also brought up concerns he had. So he's a representative from Durham. He's Black, and he grew up in Eastern North Carolina, and he spoke during the process and also brought up at the trial concerns he had about the lack of using racial data, and also how Black communities are treated in the maps. So
I think that, he made the point that I think a lot of people made during the process, which was, how are you going to ensure that Black communities aren't being diluted, that their, ability to elect representatives is being protected if you aren't looking at racial data? And in particular, he also was focused on Pitt County, which is where he grew up, and the way that ECU and its surrounding community were being treated. So we were told during the process by Representative Hall that ECU was being kept whole, and Hawkins, when he looked at the maps, did not feel that was the case. He drew some amendments that I think were later proposed to make sure that was being kept whole. And we have been consistently told that it's kept whole, and actually that's not the case. So just to show you, this is that house line. And so you can see kind of East Carolina University sort of right below where it says Greenville. And that is the main part of the campus, but that green other district that juts up, right in that crook is where the College of Health and Human Performance is, which is part of ECU. It's in a completely different district. And so, we were constantly being told that Hall was acting very proud that ECU was kept whole, and Hawkins and others noticed that this is not actually the case. And so he felt, I think Hawkins in general felt that this was sort of indicative of how deceptive the leadership had been during the whole process.
Mm-hmm. And also just, unwilling to hear other members'
concerns.
To
hear people, from those communities talk about how the maps could be negatively impacting those communities.
Mm-hmm. And at one point I thought it was really powerful too. The lawyers asked him, if in the process, like you mentioned, that he and others had asked whether materials were being used, whether any outside materials were brought in, and he said that he felt lied to. Mm-hmm. And it came out in the trial that there were actually materials that at least one of the map drawers was using.
Yeah, so maybe we should talk about the actual defendants, people who came and testified.
Yeah, so the defendants who, other than the expert witness, they also called the defendants, people who drew the maps. And so who did they call and who didn't they call?
Yeah, so the legislative defendants, the actual defendants who came and testified, were chosen, they chose themselves. So legislators have to waive legislative privilege to testify, basically. That means that legislative privilege it's a legal principle that they don't really have to talk about how things get done at the legislature, because it's sort of supposed to protect their ability to negotiate and make deals, I guess. And so if a legislator testifies, it's because they choose to. And so the legislators that testified were Senator Hayes, who was one of the co-chairs of the Senate Redistricting Committee. There were two other co-chairs. And there was Representative Hall also testified. And one thing that the plaintiffs said during their closing arguments was that clearly, the defendants got to pick and choose who waived legislative privilege, and the plaintiffs just couldn't call on whatever legislators they wanted to. They had to only go with whoever the defense chose to testify. And some of the plaintiffs in their closing arguments said that they felt that may have been because they chose the people who were sort of in possession of like the least incriminating information, possibly. So that was really interesting to hear from the plaintiffs. And so we did get Hayes and Hall both testified.
And so Hayes was one of the chairs of the Senate Redistricting Committee, and Hall was the chair, the only chair.
Yeah, there was only one chair of the House Redistricting Committee. And it seems like the reason that the defense called on them was to talk about their reasons behind the maps. Because one of the defense's arguments is that, well, just looking at the criteria isn't enough. The legislators had all kinds of reasons that they drew the lines, and that they had all these unique reasons, and that's why it turned out the way that it did. And so they called Hayes and Hall, I think, on their side primarily because they wanted them to explain some of their choices. But just personally listening to their choices, their reasons for why they drew the maps, I didn't find them particularly specific. So to give you an example, I'll use Forsyth County. So in the Senate maps, there are a couple of districts in Forsyth County, and basically Senator Hayes said, okay, when we were drawing the Senate maps, we were drawing them this way to make sure we were keeping Winston-Salem together as much as possible. But,
seems reasonable.
Yeah, it seems reasonable. But that doesn't actually explain all of the lines, right? Because if I tell 10 different people, okay, I want you to draw districts here that keep Winston-Salem whole as much as possible, I'll get 10 different results. Those lines are not going to be exactly the same.
It's not like only the municipal boundaries were the boundaries of they had to make all these choices.
Yeah, you have to make choices because, the city isn't perfectly aligned with the districts and vice versa. And so choices are going to be made. So that's not a very specific directive. And so, personally, I just felt that was not the kind of specific explanation that would only give you one map result. Mm-hmm. And then similarly, when Hall was asked reasons, and going back to Forsyth County, he said, okay, there's sort of a district in the enacted map that comes down from Stokes County, which is the rural county in that county grouping, comes into Winston-Salem, captures Wake Forest University, and is pairing it with this much more rural area. And basically he said, well, we drew it this way because we wanted to keep Wake Forest University whole. But again, like, if I tell you, hey, draw this map and keep Wake Forest University whole, like, pairing it with Stokes, taking out of the rest of Winston-Salem and pairing with Stokes County is not the only way that you can do that. So again, didn't feel very specific.
And didn't explain a very strange choice that was made.
Yeah, it just does, doesn't seem like that's the only way that you can do that, and again, like, there were a lot of things like that where they said, oh, well, we were trying to preserve the cores of prior districts, which is something that map drawers often do, but they didn't do that consistently across the board. That wasn't like they applied it in every single county grouping. They only kind of applied it sometimes. Their explanations didn't seem to dictate perfectly this particular map outcome.
No, they seemed perfunctory, and
and
trying to explain.
One thing that one of the plaintiffs' experts says was, you can come up with any kind of post hoc explanation. You can kind of do a post hoc explanation for anything after the fact. That's actually not very helpful when it comes to evaluating maps.
And also on this topic, I think maybe you'll remember who said this. One of the expert witnesses testified that it seemed like the criteria to keep municipalities whole was very closely followed in the Senate maps, but not in the House maps.
Yeah, as I recall, I think it was Professor Mattingly who said that when he kind of looked at the effects of preserving municipalities, he found that setting the bounds kind of high, like working really hard to preserve municipalities in the Senate map, made those maps more Republican favoring. That's what he said he found. And then he said he found if you did the same thing in the House maps, it actually did not have any effect on whether or not, it didn't make the maps more favorable for Republicans. And so he said that basically what he saw was that the enacted maps are very particular about keeping municipalities whole in the Senate, do not show any kind of particularly strong respect for municipalities in the House, and he felt that that lined up with whether or not keeping municipalities whole happened to be advantageous for Republicans.
Interesting. So now let's talk about, we heard some other very interesting testimony from Representative Hall.
Yeah, so this first came out because Senator Hayes was asked about it, and basically that was the moment at which the plaintiff said, in deposition, Representative Hall told us that he actually used what he called concept maps. And
they asked Hayes.
They asked Hayes about that
on the stand.
And Hayes kind of said, "Yeah, I think I maybe heard something about that. I don't know. I don't really know what that was." So that was sort of our first taste, and I think everyone in the courtroom who wasn't one of the lawyers who already knew about this was like, "Oh, okay, what's going on here?" And then so finally, when Hall was testifying, he was asked about it, and he admitted that in drawing the maps, he had used what he called concept maps, which were basically just maps of this is what he said. So let's just say we have no idea what these concept maps look like. But what he said was that these were maps of particular county groupings, 5, 6, 7. We don't know exactly how many he looked at. He didn't give a firm number of that.
He did mention some of the counties, though.
Yeah, he did say, I'm not really...
I thought it was Wake and Guilford and...
I think you might be right about that. I think maybe Buncombe as well. I'm not sure which ones, but he did mention some specific county groupings, maps, concept maps that he looked at. And he said... So the upshot of this is that he used these maps, right? So he had regular meetings with a staff member named Dylan Reel, who showed him these maps. He would regularly meet with this person along with other aides, including people from Senator Phil Berger's office, who's the president pro tem of the Senate.
For their strategy meetings.
For their strategy meetings, they would look at these maps, and that would sort of give them the game plan for that particular county grouping. We didn't, it's unclear what kind of data was used to make those maps,
or who
made them. I think that we don't know for sure that Mr. Reel made those maps either. He may be just the person who was showing them. We don't know where they were made, what data they were made, was being used in their made. So basically, Hall is kind of breaking their own rules about only
someone made maps outside of the room that were shared with Hall.
Yeah.
And
I'll just say that Hall's basically defense for all of this was a few different things that he said. So he said, well, the process was so rushed. I had to draw this whole house map by myself. I don't know why he had to draw it by himself, actually.
I don't think that
there was a reason for that. But he said, I had to draw this whole map by myself, and, we just didn't have enough time, so I had to look at these maps, so, otherwise I have to do everything. And, well...
It's a time saver.
It was a time saver, and then he was kind of asked, well, you could have delayed the process. I mean, you were asked many times by Democrats, like, why aren't we moving the primary back? Why is the process so rushed? So that didn't make a whole lot of sense because it didn't have to be like that. It was sort of like that because of their choices.
Right. Or, they had 4 terminals. Anyone else could have made
other people could have been helping him. They could have moved back the primary. They could have been doing work before the census. Just all kinds of reasons why it didn't have to be rushed.
Hold up at all.
And then, he also said, well, I didn't even really use these maps. I barely looked at them. Like, they don't have any, I didn't really use them at all. I barely looked at them. But again, like, we have no way of verifying that because those maps have been lost and or destroyed. They were lost and or destroyed before the plaintiffs could ever see them. So we have no idea what resemblance they would actually bear to the enacted maps, if they would look exactly like them, if they would look totally different. We just have no idea because they were lost and or destroyed.
And we can't ask. There was a person, Dylan Reel, who was, Hall said he had asked Mr. Reel to make the maps. We don't know if he's the one that actually made them, but he no longer, we didn't hear from him because he no longer works at the legislature.
Yeah, he now works as a very highly paid lobbyist for one of the biggest lobbying firms in Raleigh. And so therefore, no longer being staff of the legislature, he cannot be called.
He can't be called in the... It's just convenient. So we don't know what was on those maps, but it was a pretty big deal. I mean, it made a
Yeah.
splash.
Let me just show you. So this is a quotation. So we heard from Hawkins, and Hawkins kind of asked Hall on the front end. He said, before map making started, he said, are any maps being drawn outside the room? And Hall said,
this was a big concern of probably Democrats.
Yeah, they really asked.
They asked several times.
Mm-hmm. And Hall said no. And then, in questioning, Hall said, well, I said no because at that point the maps hadn't been drawn. The concept maps hadn't been drawn yet because map drawing hadn't started. Mm-hmm. But this also came up. So this is a question that was asked on the floor. So during the floor debate, I guess, over the House maps. So this means when the House maps had already been filed as a bill, they'd already been voted out of committee. They were more or less finalized, and they were coming up for a vote on the floor of the House. And during that time, Representative Morey asked Hall on the floor, when you left those rooms, were there any materials that you referred to or consulted with to make changes when you came back into the room to keep drawing the maps? Were there any demographic material, other materials you would use to make changes? And when Representative Hall was asked that by Representative Morey, he said no. And we now know that was not true. We now know that he was consulting with these quote-unquote concept maps during the process. So clearly he was not being truthful.
Yeah. So that was a big moment, a big revelation.
I mean, just sort of like, I think a lot of the journalists were like, this was the bombshell of the whole trial.
And also just, North Carolina. Could we just not have secret maps one time?
I know.
So that was the, that was a, not so short synopsis of the trial, but lots shorter than the 24 hours that you spent watching the whole thing. So.
Oh man, it was more than 24 hours, right? Yeah. It was at least 28 hours.
Yeah, you're right. So, but that's, I think, a pretty good kind of overview of what happened. Obviously, the WRAL has the videos. If people want to go back and watch any of this, you can do that. But and
if you want to go back and watch it, you can, message me and I'll tell you my favorite parts.
That's true. Yeah. It's a good idea. What do we expect to happen now?
So what we know is that the state Supreme Court, this trial is happening because the state Supreme Court granted a preliminary injunction and ordered for this trial to happen. And so
Before any elections.
And so in that, the state Supreme Court moved back the primary elections to May 17th and ordered this trial court to come out with some kind of ruling by the 11th. And so that 11th of January. Yeah. And so we expect that we will have a ruling on or before January 11th.
Which is Tuesday.
Which is this coming Tuesday. And so we will know what the trial court decided. And then after that, either party, depending on the outcome, will have the opportunity to appeal to the state Supreme Court. And they have to do that within a couple days. So clearly the state Supreme Court has an interest in keeping this moving.
And it'll bypass any appellate court. It'll go straight to the Supreme Court.
The state Supreme Court.
So then it'll potentially go to the Supreme Court as early as next week.
We may know by the end of next week whether or not that's going to happen.
And then it's sort of a little bit more open-ended about what the Supreme Court does and whether there's a redraw.
Yeah. I mean, just to say, to kind of keep with the timeline of having primaries in mid-May, this stuff kind of has to move pretty quickly, just to make sure that those elections can be held kind of under all of the lawful restrictions that they have.
So we think that there will be some kind of resolution by the end of February.
Yeah, I mean, just working back from, if you have an election, there's a certain time before that when absentee ballots have to go out. Takes the Board of Elections a certain amount of time to print those ballots in the first place. Before they start printing ballots, there has to be candidate filing. You have to know who's running. And so just because of all those different things, if you kind of try to work backward, it seems like there has to be some kind of resolution by the end of February just to make all of those sort of legally required dates.
But we will be here.
Yes.
Regardless. Yes. And keeping you up to date.
Yeah. And so we will be having our January volunteer meeting.
Is next week.
On the 13th, and so that will be after the ruling is handed down, so we will hopefully have more information for you and something else. Some fun actions to do. Then. Yeah, we'll know something else and hopefully have some stuff for you to do.
Okay, well, thanks, Lekha, for breaking it all down and watching.
Thanks, Bri. I know that was probably way longer than we meant for it to be.
It always is.
You know. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us.
Thanks for watching.
We'll talk to you soon. Bye.